Alright guys, this will be video 1 for APUSH for Wednesday, April 22nd. We were picking up with the railroads and development in the West. On the western frontier, ranching and mining were growing industries. Ranchers drove their herds across the western plains and deserts, ignoring property rights of Native Americans' prerogatives to the land. Individual miners lacked the resources to mine and cart big loads, so mostly they prospected. When they found a rich mine, they staked a claim and sold their rights to a mining company. In the second year of the Civil War, Lincoln issued a challenge to America, not unlike Kennedy's 1961 pledge to reach the moon, that before the decade was out, America would have a transcontinental railroad connecting one side of the country to the other. From 1863 to 1869, former farmers, immigrants, freed slaves, and Civil War veterans worked to make Lincoln's vision a reality. The railroad's arrival changed the West in many ways. The railroads, although owned privately, were built largely at the public's expense through direct funding and substantial grants of land to the railroads. Both federal and local governments were anxious for rails to be completed and so provided substantial assistance. Although the public had paid for the rail system, rail proprietors strenuously objected to any government control of their industry, and it took years for railroad rates to come under regulation. Until they were regulated, the railroads would typically overcharge wherever they owned a monopoly, and undercharge in competitive and heavily trafficked markets. This practice was particularly harmful to farmers in remote areas. As railroad construction crawled across the nation, rail companies organized massive hunts for buffalo, considered a nuisance. Railroad bounty hunters hunted the herds to near extinction, destroying a resource upon which local Native Americans had depended. Some tribes, such as the Sioux, fought back, giving the government an excuse to send troops into a region. While Native Americans won some battles, most notably the Battle of Little Bighorn, where George Custer met his death, the Federal Army ultimately overpowered them. The railroads brought other changes as well. Rails quickly transformed depot towns into vital cities by connecting them to civilizations. Easier, faster travel meant more contact with ideas and technological advances from the East. Developments in railroad technology had applications in other industries and so accelerated the Industrial Revolution. In addition, railroad time, by which rail schedules were determined, gave the nation its first standardized method of time telling with the adoption of time zones. As the rails pushed the country westward, settlers started filling in the territory. By 1889, North Dakota, South Dakota, Washington, and Montana were populous enough to achieve statehood. Wyoming and Idaho followed in 1890. The result of the 1890 census prompted the progressive historian Frederick Jackson Turner to declare the American frontier was gone, and with it, its first period of American history. Turner argued that the frontier was significant to 1. Shaping the American character, 2. Defining the American spirit, 3. Fostering democracy, and 4. Providing a safety valve for economic distress in urban industrial centers by providing a place to which people could flee. Historians refer to these ideas collectively as the Turner or frontier thesis. In the Great Plains, farming and ranching constituted the main forms of employment. New farm machinery and access to mail and mail order retail made life on the plains easier, but it was still lonely and difficult. The government, realizing the potential of the region as the nation's chief agricultural center, passed 2 significant pieces of legislation in 1862, the Homestead Act and the Morrill Land Grant Act. Anxious to attract settlers to develop the West, the federal government offered 160 acres of land to anyone who would homestead or cultivate the land, build a home, and live there for 5 years. Of course, the government was giving away land that belonged to Native Americans. Furthermore, private speculators and railroad companies often exploited the law for their own personal economic gain. The Morrill Land Grant Act set aside land and provided money for agricultural colleges. Eventually, agricultural science became a huge industry in the United States. The big losers in this expansionist era, of course, were Native Americans. At first, pioneers approached the tribes as sovereign nations. They made treaties with them, which the settlers and their immediate successors broke. The result was warfare, leading the government to try another approach. The new tack was to force Native Americans onto reservations, which typically were made up of the least desirable land in a tribe's traditional home region. The reservation system failed for a number of reasons, including the inferiority of the land, the grouping of incompatible tribes on the same reservation, and the lack of autonomy granted the tribes in managing their own affairs. Moreover, some Westerners simply ignored the arrangement and poached on reservation lands. Helen Hunt Jackson's book, A Century of Dishonor, detailed the injustices of the reservation system and inspired several reformers to push for change, which came in 1887 in the form of the Dawes Severalty Act, or the Dawes Act. The Dawes Severalty Act broke up the reservations and distributed some of the land to the head of each Native American's family. Similar to the Homestead Act, the allotment was 160 acres of land. This time, however, it was required that the family live on the land for 25 years, after which time the land was legally theirs, and the grand prize was American citizenship. The Dawes Act was intended as a humanitarian solution to the Indian problem. Its main goal was to accelerate the assimilation of Native Americans into Western society by integrating them more closely with the whites. Native Americans naturally resisted. Furthermore, poverty drove many to sell their land to speculators, leaving them literally homeless. By the time the policy set by the Dawes Act was reversed in 1934, the Native American nations were decimated. National politics. Mark Twain dubbed the era between Reconstruction and 1900 the Gilded Age of politics. Gilded metals have a shiny gold-like surface, but beneath lies a cheap base. America looked to have entered a period of prosperity with a handful of families having amassed unprecedented wealth, but the affluence of a few was built on the poverty of many. Similarly, American politics looked like a shining example of representative democracy, but just beneath the surface lay crass corruption and patronage. Political machines, not municipal governments, ran the cities. Big business bought votes in Congress and then turned around and fleeced consumers. Workers had little protection from the greed of their employers because the courts turned a deaf ear to worker complaints. In other words, Twain was right on the money. The presidents of this era were generally not corrupt. They were, however, relatively weak. The president is only as powerful as support allows him to be. Thus, popular presidents like Andrew Jackson and Franklin Roosevelt were able to accomplish so much. Don't expect too many questions about presidents of this period, but for the record, Rutherford Hayes, James Garfield, and Chester Arthur concerned themselves primarily with civil service reform, while Grover Cleveland believed that the government governed best, which governed least. Benjamin Harrison took the opposite tack, and he and his allies in the Capitol passed everything from the nation's first Meat Inspection Act to the banning of lotteries to the purchase of several battleships. Much of the legislation we have discussed, from the Sherman Antitrust Act to the Second Moral Land Grant Colleges Act, was passed under Harrison's watch. But the public's discomfort with the activism of Harrison in the Billion-Dollar Congress of 1890 led to Grover Cleveland's return to the White House. In response to the outcry over widespread corruption, the government made its first stabs at regulating itself in business. Many states imposed railroad regulations because railroads were engaging in price gouging. In 1877, the Supreme Court upheld an Illinois state law regulating railroads and grain elevators in the case of Munn v. Illinois. This was a surprising decision given that railroads cross state lines and only Congress can regulate interstate commerce. The court argued that states had the power to regulate private industry that served the public interest. Although the Supreme Court reaffirmed Congress's authority 9 years later in the Wabash case, when it was ruled that states could not establish rates involving interstate commerce, an important precedent for regulating business in the public's interest had been established. All right, civil service reform. There's a little sidebar. The spoil system pioneered by Andrew Jackson meant that every time a new president took office, thousands of government jobs opened up, and it was the president's responsibility to fill them. This is what the presidents of the mid-19th century did with their days. For instance, even as the Civil War raged, Abraham Lincoln spent morning, afternoon, and evening dealing with the job applicants who lined up outside his office, the line winding through the White House and out the door into Pennsylvania Avenue. Within the Republican Party, who dominated control of the White House following the Civil War, a split developed between stalwarts who believed that all government jobs should go to loyal Republicans, and half-breeds who thought the qualified Democrats should be able to keep their jobs even after a Republican was elected. When a frustrated job seeker assassinated Garfield, it became clear that something had to be done about the way government employees was handled. His successor, Chester Arthur, had been a stalwart, but he signed the Pendleton Civil Service Act Reform Act that began dismantling the old spoil system. All right. In 1887, just 1 year after the Wabash decision, Congress passed the first federal regulatory law in history. The Interstate Commerce Act set up the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, to supervise railroad activities and regulate unfair and unethical practices. The ICC wasn't disbanded until the 1980s under the Reagan administration, when, in attempts to save money, the federal government deregulated many forms of transportation. It was also during this period that women's suffrage became an important political issue. Susan B. Anthony led the fight, convincing Congress to introduce a suffrage amendment to the Constitution. The bill was introduced every year, rarely got out of committee, but the fight had begun in earnest. Meanwhile, organizations such as the American Suffrage Association fought for women's suffrage amendments to state constitutions. By 1890, they had achieved some partial successes, gaining the vote on school issues. All right, so we're going to stop the first video.